It was Sunday, the 8th of October. All day the air felt thick as a feather quilt. One minute the wind blew, and the next, the whole world was still and waiting. Papa was waiting. Smells like smoke, but it feels like a storm's a comin', Papa said. If this wind picks up, the country could be one giant fireball. Early in the morning, Papa walked into town. While he was gone, Mama paced from the front door to the garden and back again. She stared into the forest to the west and held her apron over her mouth and nose just to breathe. First, the wind raced up the hill like a runaway horse. Then, just as quickly, it stopped, and the silence took over again. Papa came back grumbling and worrying. He paced back and forth like a dog on a chain. Even Lydia and little Nels could tell something wasn't right. Mama and Papa stood outside and whispered. I crept in behind the door and listened. The railroad brought in 100 new men this morning, he complained. Greenhorns, all of them. Greenhorns have leave fires burning. They don't keep the brush cleared away from the tracks. Folks say down at the harbor the smoke has been so thick the boats sound their horns all day to just keep from hitting each other. And greenhorns are newcomers. I don't like the feel of the air, Mama said, and I don't like the look of the sky over the sugar bush. I'm worried about my sister Lydia and her baby. Nobody said a word for so long that I could hear my heart banging inside my chest like a bird trying to escape from its cage. Mama's sister Lydia lived west of Peshtigo where the sugar maples grew. Her big, handsome husband had taken a job up north in the lumber camps. He'd be gone all winter, so Lydia was alone with their baby. I peeked around the door frame. Looking to the west, I could see the tops of sugar maple trees. I could also see smoke as thick as fog. Finally, Papa spoke. I'm going to fetch Lydia and the baby. Mama nodded. At the first sign of fire, we'll wet blankets to cover our heads and go to the river. Papa wrapped his big lumberjack arms around my mama. I married more than the prettiest girl in Wisconsin, Papa said. I also married the bravest. In a rush, Papa hugged Lydia and Nels and snatched his coat from the hook behind the door. His bright blue eyes looked straight into mine. He didn't even call me Little Red. He called me my grown-up name. Susanna, he said, it'll take me about 3 hours to reach Aunt Lydia, then 3 or 4 hours home again. At the first sign of fire, you take the little ones and go to the river. You and your mama. Don't worry about saving anything. Just get to the river. Mama handed him a blanket, a canteen of water, and a couple of burlap sacks. I watched as my papa walked out the door and to the top of the hill, past the big white house where Mr. McCartney lived. I watched as he walked over the hill toward the sugar bush and disappeared into the smoke. Mom and I hurried out to the well. She wrapped her grandmother's silver candlesticks in a burlap sack and lowered them into the water. Then she sent me up to the big white house where Mr. McCartney lived. Wrapping those candlesticks kind of sounds like Addie in our story and Addie across the prairie with the prairie fire. They're city people, she said. They won't understand this strange weather. Not a one of them has enough sense to head for the river. The manservant answered the door. Sir, I stammered. My papa says that the sugar bush is burning. He knows the forest, and he says the wind isn't right. Papa says we should go to the river at the first sign of fire. The man smiled at me like I was Nels, talking like a baby. Why aren't you a sweet little thing? He said with a smile. You just run along home and tell your papa not to worry. Mr. McCartney hired a team to plow a good fire break around the property. Our well is the best in the country. or in the county. A fire break, that's that plowed area so that the fire can't jump over it. Just then, Mr. McCartney himself walked into the room. "Who's at the door, James?" he said. The manservant told him why I'd come. Mr. McCartney stared so that I wished I could disappear right into the ground. "Young lady," Mr. McCartney said with a scowl, if we ran to the river every time we saw a fire in the sugar bush, we'd come back to find thieves had made off with every stick of silver and every painting in the house." Mr. McCartney kept staring. I stared right back. I couldn't help myself. Mama said they were city folk who didn't understand. Papa wouldn't have been so kind. He would have said they were fools to risk their lives for silver and paintings. I turned from home without a word, or for home without a word. An hour passed, then 2, 3. Thick smoke stung my eyes. In the late afternoon, the sky looked almost like night. "Mama, will it rain?" Lydia asked. Mama sat in her maple rocking chair and pulled Lydia and Nels onto her lap. I wished I could crawl up there too. "A good rain might put fires out," Mama said. "We'll wait and see." Mama didn't even light the stove. We are cold. We are We ate cold cornbread and applesauce. Lydia and Nels took naps. I sat by the window waiting and worrying. The sky grew darker. How would Papa and Lydia find their way from the sugar bush? Worry almost choked me. No matter what Mama said, the sky didn't smell like rain. It smelled like smoke and fire. Suddenly, I heard a howling sound coming from the smoke. My whole body began to shiver. How would Papa find his way through the blinding, breath-stealing smoke? Just as quickly as it came, the howl died away. Mama's face looked as pale as flour. She began to pull blankets from the beds. "It's time," she said. "But Papa!" I didn't mean to shout, but my voice almost echoed from the ceiling. Little Nels woke and began to cry. Mama lifted coats from their hooks. "I'll go fetch burlap sacks from the shed," she said. "Get the children wrapped up." My mind whirled like a fireball. Papa wanted to bring Aunt Lydia where she'd be safe. He'd head for the river too, but how could he find his way from the sugar bush when he couldn't see? Suddenly, I remembered rushing home after school on winter afternoons. I remembered watching the clock hands move to 6 o'clock so I could run out and call Papa home. I remembered tossing stones at the bell on the roof of our funny used to be schoolhouse house. I felt hot, like standing too close to the stove. Could I call Papa home from the sugar bush? Maybe not, but I had to try. Like a wild thing, I raced out of our little house. How could I ring the bell without a rope or a ringer? Tossing stones wouldn't make the bell ring loud enough. I fumbled through Mama's kitchen. Could I use a soup ladle? Too light. Butcher knife? Too sharp. The iron poker Mama used to push wood into the stove was too thin and long. A brick was too short. Papa kept his indoor tools in a small wooden bucket. There was an axe, too heavy. A handsaw, too light. Frantically, I pulled everything from the bucket. My fingers wrapped around the wooden handle as long as my forearm. On the end was an iron block about as big as my fist. It was smooth on one side, and on the other was a circle with the letter R inside. Papa's logger's mark. We used a stamper's mark. Papa had brought his logger's mark all the way from the Chippewa. How many logs had Papa marked for Red and Ole's crew with this hammer? I pulled on my coat, held the mark next to my heart, and ran to the door. Nels was wailing now, and Lydia kept calling, "Mama, Susanna, I'm scared." And that's where we are going to end.